Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Civics Project, episode 38, the minimum wage. And I'm glad to have you with us. And it's exciting to be talking about a really urgent topic. Before we dive into the primary content, I want to begin with a brief land acknowledgement. I also do want to introduce myself, though. I'm Beth Roubaix, the host of the Civics Project and the Director of Repair, which sponsors the Civics Project. So to begin with that land acknowledgement, Repair acknowledges the Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work for the Taraha Tone, the indigenous peoples in this place. We pay our respects to Hanuk Vatam, the ancestors, Hihiram, the elders, and Iohinkem, our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging. As noted, our subject matter today focuses on the minimum wage. The minimum wage in the United States was created in 1938 as part of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, and it was created by the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is still with us today. The stated purpose of the Fair Labor Standards Act was to eliminate, quote, labor standards detrimental to the maintenance of the minimum standard of living necessary for health, efficiency, and general well-being of workers. It also had another purpose, which was to protect businesses that were interacting with workers more fairly from unfair competition by businesses which were cutting their costs by exploiting their workers. So the basic message is this is good for industry and the economy. It's important for workers' health and productivity as well. So again, Fair Labor Standards Act passed in 1938 as part of the New Deal meant to revitalize the economy and pull it out of the Great Depression under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The first minimum wage in the United States was a quarter, 25 cents. And that was as of 1938. It went up the next year, 1939, to 30 cents, a big jump in wages at the time. It didn't hit a full dollar, so there were gradual increases over time. It didn't hit a dollar until 1956. After that, it was gradually raised over time, not on any particular schedule necessarily, so it would basically get raised when the political winds were blowing in the right direction in Congress and the Department of Labor. Mostly since the 1950s, the minimum wage might be raised more frequently, but it at least was raised in less than a decade at a time. So I think one of the longest delays was like 9 years and about 8 or 9 months, but a full decade didn't go by after the 1950s until very recently. So now our last increase was in summer of 2009, and that brought the minimum wage up from the $6 range to $7.25. And unlike basically the prior 60 years before that, the minimum wage has not continued to see any increases. It got stuck in 2009 at $7.25. So basically it was raised at the beginning of Obama's presidency. And I think part of the challenge is that in the Trump era, normally we would have seen another raise by now, but that didn't happen in the last Congress. The Fair Labor Standards Act has some exceptions around when minimum wage rules are enforced. So one that it's had historically that thankfully isn't used too often, but does still show up, is that there's some specific programs that will allow less than minimum wage for basically like vocational and occupational activities for people with severe and developmental disabilities. So basically you're allowed to employ someone disabled at a sub-minimum wage. That's something I'm very critical of. And thankfully it's not an extremely widespread practice. But it's problematic that there's been this exception allowing you to pay less to workers with disabilities based on, I think, notions that workers with disabilities are inherently less productive, which isn't necessarily true and still doesn't really justify a wage that isn't sufficient to live on. There have also been some exceptions for workers under 20 who are going through, under 20 years of age who are going through job training. And a major category of subminimum wage exception involves workers who are in the category of being tipped. Employers can set minimum wage for workers in that field as low as $2.13 in today's wages, which is very low and doesn't guarantee a living or a minimum wage, given that tips are not always very reliable. So employers basically, sort of using tipping as a way to circumvent minimum wage law. And there's some other ways in which minimum wage law gets circumvented. One is by having workers be paid by item or unit. So for instance, workers who are farming being paid for each carton of strawberries being picked, when the reality is that somebody working at a normal pace won't be able to pick enough strawberries to reach the minimum wage in an hour, but they'll call it piecework and say, well, we're just paying you per item. So there are different ways in which even the low minimum wage we have can get circumvented. One question people often raise is sort of what was happening before the Fair Labor Standards Act. And one of two things was generally happening. Actually, three things. One is that there just wasn't a realistic minimum wage. Employers did what they wanted to do and everything was driven by the market. A second was that minimum wages were established in localized workplaces or industry through negotiation and conflict between labor unions and employers. So basically the labor movement bore the brunt of advancing minimum wage standards. And of course, that only protected those workers who were unionized. And a third option was if at the state or municipal level, there was some, basically protection put in that would ensure that workers were receiving a fair wage. But that certainly was not consistent or even all that widespread. So after the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed, higher wages for workers were still won by unions. So it didn't mean that whatever the Fair Labor Standards Act minimum wage was applicable in every workplace. Some workplaces were able to get their wages higher because the workers organized for it. And as the labor movement would push the minimum wage up in a particular workplace through their bargaining and negotiations, and sometimes protest activities like going on strike, that would sometimes get the federal government to eventually catch up and go, okay, this is what's really normal, across industries. And so we should push the minimum wage up at the federal level as well. So in practice, minimum wages tended to be an interplay between the Fair Labor Standards Act, the advocacy from the labor movement, and sometimes state and municipal law. And other, market forces. Sometimes the wage norms would go up in a particular industry because more workers were needed. So the labor movement really hit its peak, where it was very powerful in the United States in the 1940s and 50s. So it was basically representing over 1/3 of all workers in the United States in that era. And what changed can in part, not entirely, but can in part be attributed to the McCarthy era. For those of you who are familiar, the McCarthy era began in the 1940s, really gained traction after World War II, and culminated in 1954. For those who don't know the history of the McCarthy era, I don't think we can do it justice today, but most of you've heard the infamous phrase, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? The reason the McCarthy era wound up being so damaging to labor unions was largely attributable to the fact that while most union members were not communists or socialists or otherwise active in those movements, the labor movement was where basically you could find people who were actual members of the Communist Party. And industrial sectors and conservative parts of the US government jumped on this fact to try to discredit the labor movement, to accuse it of being unpatriotic and trying to undermine capitalism and thereby American democracy. And so they did a lot of damage to the public standing of labor movements, and in addition, some labor movement leaders, whether because they actually were communist or because they were questioned and treated as suspect of being communist because they were fighting for workers, all of that also made workers more scared to organize hard through labor movements. So the labor movement today represents a little under 11% of American workers, where it was just under 35% 70 years ago, or 60, I guess it would be 7 years ago, in 60, yeah, about 67 years ago in 1954. Now that dropped from just under 35% to today it's about 10.8%, isn't only due to the McCarthy era. It was one of several influences. But the consequence is that our economy, our labor force, lost some of the push to keep raising the minimum wage. A few other things happened in the last 50 to 70 years that bear noting. We can talk, for instance, about Reaganomics, referring to the economic policies and approaches in the 1980s of Ronald Reagan, who proposed that our economy should be organized to benefit corporations, with the assumption that the benefits would then trickle down to workers, also sometimes referred to as trickle down economics. This didn't happen, but it increased the influence and power and ability of corporations to essentially do what they wanted to maximize profits. And at least some analysts will point to ways in which this weakened the impact of the labor movement and also weakened the import and impact of US labor law, which has often reflected a struggle between labor unions and industries. Another landmark came in the 1990s under President Bill Clinton, and that was the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was signed into law in 1993. NAFTA was an agreement between the US, Canada, and Mexico, which basically eliminated most tariffs and trade costs, basically associated with moving things across borders. And one of the reasons that this weakened the labor movement and therefore the push for the minimum wage was that it made it more profitable for companies to take jobs that workers had been doing in the United States and move them down, particularly to Mexico, knowing that whatever goods they produced, they could then bring back into the country without facing tariffs. So it made it extremely profitable to move labor costs into countries with much lower labor standards, lower minimum wage, fewer protections for workers who are vulnerable. And that meant that you started to see more plants and factories and manufacturing sectors in the United States basically move their jobs out of the country. This really weakened the impact of the labor movement. Some unions outright died because the industries they were representing American workers in no longer had enough workers to really have any impact. Again, as more of those jobs left the country. So, and more broadly, globalization, referring to the erosion of national borders in certain respects and the creation of one global economy, really created crises for the labor movement. So we were in a position where we were more reliant in the United States for the federal government on its own to keep moving the minimum wage. And what we've seen is that they've stopped doing it. So I want to talk a little bit about what happens when the minimum wage is not keeping pace with the economy at the time and the needs of workers at the time. So one impact of this is it causes an increased drain on social welfare systems, on our safety net. So we know, for instance, Walmart, which is a very large employer in the United States, as well as some fast food industries, Amazon. Some of these large corporate entities will give their workers explicit guidance for how to qualify for state and municipal economic benefits because their income is so low that they are basically at the poverty line. So they'll be giving their workers information in addition to our very low wages, right? Here's how you can qualify for food stamps or housing assistance or for partial unemployment benefits, because even though you're working a significant number of hours for us, you're not making enough to meet the threshold after which you become ineligible for unemployment. So people could be employed and still qualify for unemployment benefits because they were making so little. So that's been happening for quite a while in the United States. And what it means is that these companies get to employ very low wage workers. The federal minimum wage right now, as noted, is at $7.25, which is not survivable in most of the United States. And then the taxpayers in those states and nationwide bear the benefit of supporting the welfare systems and social safety net systems like unemployment insurance and others. Unemployment insurance is partly employer supported, but still can have an impact for taxpayers, and other kinds of poverty relief programs like, again, food stamps and housing assistance. And by food stamps, I mean, in today's terminology, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. All of those programs are reaching our tax dollars and coming out of state and federal budgets. So in practice, it's allowed employers to do things that are not healthy for workers and left it to state and federal governments to take care of those workers, which they sometimes do and sometimes don't. In addition, remember that one of the original purposes of the Fair Labor Standards Act was to prevent unfair competition, right? To say, we can't have employers who are exploiting the heck out of their workers and able to then produce things and sell things for very little money and driving the small businesses and the ethical businesses out of business. And in practice, what we've seen is decreasing viability of small businesses and, sort of Amazon becoming everybody's vendor of choice much of the time. I won't say everybody, but for many people, and I'm guilty of this as well, becoming the sort of most affordable or rapid alternative, and doing so because they're exploiting workers. And then as a consequence, a lot of small businesses or small vendors get driven out of business or have to do business through Amazon and give them a cut. There's also a set of health and familial impacts for people's bodies and families and psyches of the low minimum wage. So one of the things that we know is when the minimum wage is not keeping up with the cost of living, we see increases in housing and food insecurity, which of course is incredibly damaging for health. We also see increased overwork, people packaging together multiple part-time jobs or a full-time job and a part-time job or little bits of gig work here and there to basically get to the point where they can survive. And the consequence of that can be severe overwork. And we know over time, overwork is one of the largest contributors to heart disease, which is the #1 killer in the United States. Overwork also weakens the immune system over time, both through the stress of it and by cutting into people's ability to sleep, which is, of course, needed to repair and strengthen our bodies. A weakened immune system makes you much more vulnerable to cancer, and that's our #2 killer. Overwork is also unhealthy for metabolism, which is a precursor, which is a major risk factor for diabetes, which is our #3 killer. So all of this helps us understand why people who are, basically not employed at a way that covers the cost of living, or are only reaching their cost of living through severe overwork, have on average for women between a 10 to 11 year decrease in life expectancy. And for men, it's about 14 to 14 and a half years. So one of the consequences of a low minimum wage is that people die basically 10 to 14 and a half years faster than they otherwise would if they're among those who are subject to those low minimum wages. The low minimum wage also increases worker turnover. People are sort of only taking on jobs when they can't find anything better and leave those jobs as quickly as possible. We also find that while some people will still work hard under those conditions, productivity overall suffers in part because workers are often not invested in the job, but also because workers are overtired and productivity goes down, even when people are trying hard to do a good job because they're exhausted. Right? So less actually getting done in people's work hours, workers flipping between jobs very quickly. We see increased patterns of discrimination. And some of that is about the fact that workers and their employers are stressed out in these conditions. And those tensions are more likely to generate conflict, which isn't handled well. Sometimes workers begin to hurt or harass one another, again, as an expression of sort of the unmanaged trauma and stress of an economically difficult life. Another consequence of the low minimum wage is that, again, it often means that where employers can't get very invested workers who are committed to the job in the United States, that's fine because they can still keep exporting jobs. So one of the objections to raising the minimum wage is, oh, if we raise it too high, our workers won't be able to compete. They can't anyway, if what we have is a scenario in which a company can go and pay somebody at 1950s wages, can pay $1 an hour or less to workers and don't face tariffs getting goods back into the country in some cases. And if they do, they still have a hefty profit available. And so, we need to look for different solutions to make sure that workers domestically are competitive and that we drive up a global living wage to address that challenge. And of course, when jobs keep getting exported and only sort of things which need to be done locally or in the service industry are done locally, that does a lot of damage to our economy, which we have absolutely been seeing happening over the past 50 years. All of this also sustains racial and gender inequity. One of the things that we know is that we've still got patterns in the United States in which along racial and gender lines, women of color particularly, and women at large, people of color at large, are last hired, first fired. So when you've got an economy which isn't investing more deeply in its workers, one of the things that we see is that people have a lot of trouble developing job stability, and this hurts everybody, but it disproportionately hits people based on race and gender. So if we're looking to achieve better equity in the United States, one of the things we need to do is protect workers across the board. I want to discuss the concept of a living wage versus a minimum wage. The living wage, right, refers to the actual cost of living. And Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, has what's called a living wage calculator. I wouldn't say it's completely up to date on today's post-pandemic inflation era dollars, but it will give you at least a recent sense of what is the actual cost of living in a given US county in the United States for one person, for a family of 3, for a family of 4, etc. So it will tell you how much does it realistically cost to live? How much do you need to make per hour? What we see is that the bare minimum cost of living, the living wage, is generally lagging somewhere between $8 to $10 behind the federal minimum wage or the local minimum wage, even if you've got a higher one at the state level in actual dollars. So for instance, the federal minimum wage is $7.25. As I was preparing for this episode, I was just playing around a little and taking a look at different counties in the United States. So I looked at Alabama, which is a state that doesn't have its own minimum wage standard statewide higher than the federal level. So their actual minimum wage is $7.25. And even in the less expensive counties, the cost of living for one person was a little over $15. So what that means is that the minimum wage doesn't even get people to half of what it costs to actually live. And that's for a single person. And then of course your wage has to be higher, your living wage has to be higher if you are supporting or helping to support a child or other family members. So then the actual cost of living goes into the $20 range, 23 to 28. But your federal minimum wage is still $7.25. So all of this, as you can imagine, generates pretty extreme poverty. And the cost of living for people can decrease if there is more government support, more of a social safety net. So if you don't have a right to health insurance, that's either fully paid or low cost to you, right, then your cost of living is going to go up accordingly. And while in the most extreme impoverished conditions, people can qualify for Medicaid, though as we know from prior conversations, it does have a lot of problems. There are a lot of folks who don't qualify for Medicaid and don't get employer provided insurance, and basically are now at least benefiting from the Affordable Care Act to qualify for some sort of plan, but often those still have higher premiums than people can afford, even with contemporary government support. So the original vision, I think, of the Affordable Care Act was meant to ensure that health insurance would be accessible for everyone. And though the Affordable Care Act has not been repealed or overturned, a number of its protections have been weakened and eroded since its passage. And so in practice, it's inadequate for that purpose. Relatively speaking, all of this adds up to the fact that people have healthcare costs that no one else covers, or no one else covers adequately because they're not getting enough coverage under insurance plans, or there's high copays or high deductibles. And all of that amplifies the cost of living. Without if the government funds access for people who need it to childcare, of course, that reduces the cost of living for individual people and for families. And that's one of the things we know that the United States is debating now under the Build Back Better agenda. And if the government provides more forms of poverty relief, then that can reduce the cost of living, or where people are not meeting it, offset it so that, the gap between the minimum wage and living wage is not as dangerous to people's health or survival. But when you have less of a safety net and you have a low minimum wage, that's a recipe for basically rampant poverty, for lowered life expectancy, and for an economy in which workers are going to have a lot less power. We have to keep in mind too, when we look at these figures, as I noted, our rates today have not been adjusted to account for rising costs due to inflation, which we know is getting acknowledged and debated in today's media, as we're starting to sort of feel the pinch at the grocery store or the gas station or other places, or, as folks are paying their utility bills, various places where folks are trying to manage increased costs. For anyone who's not familiar, just to redefine inflation, right? Inflation refers to rising costs in times when demand exceeds supply. And I should qualify that and say that's a formal definition. And sometimes it's not that there is inadequate supply to meet the demand. Sometimes we just see profiteering and price gouging by industries, meaning they could make an adequate profit and meet the demand, but they basically decide, hey, we can, sort of act as if there's a shortage when there's really not, and use that to raise prices. So inflation, when can happen organically when demand exceeds supply, and in our current pandemic and, emerging from pandemic economy, we certainly can understand why that might be happening, as we've had a lot of industries be disrupted. And so supplies in some instances are now running low, but can also just happen essentially because of corporate greed. The next question folks might ask is, okay, so what's happening? What's going to be done about this? So directly on the question of the minimum wage, Senate Bill 53, sponsored by Bernie Sanders, and there's a companion bill in the House, HR 603, is the Raise the Wage Act of 2021. And this proposes to raise the federal minimum wage over a 5-year period. So it will go up a bit each year. So initially, if it's passed in this session of Congress, it would go up to $9.50 from $7.25. And over a 5-year period, it would get the federal minimum wage up to $15, with the possibility of further raises after that through the Secretary of Labor, as indicated, basically. So this again is Senate Bill 53, HR 603. I think the chances of it passing in the House are fairly good. In the Senate, it has 37 co-sponsors in addition to Senator Sanders. So basically 38 senators will be ready to vote for the bill as is, and possibly some more would sign on. And as you know, or probably know, we need 51 votes to pass legislation in the Senate. So for the minimum wage to go up, as Senator Sanders is proposing, will basically take another 13 votes that they may or may not be moving towards yet. So that's one issue, to raise the minimum wage, but we want to recognize that the minimum wage is interconnected into these other areas of labor law and economic equity. So one solution is to really think about how to reinvigorate the labor movement. And thankfully, we're seeing that right now happening. We've seen new labor unions forming and strikes going on in industries that haven't had strikes in a long time across the country. We scheduled this episode of Civics Project a while ago. And just in this past week, I'm a member of a labor union, the American Federation of Teachers, and we called for a strike. We were supposed to go out on Wednesday and Thursday in the University of California system. And at 4:30 in the morning on the first day of the strike, the University of California finally settled, bargained in good faith with the union. And among other things, we want to raise, as well as, different kinds of protections for abuses in the workplace and workload. And around the country, we're seeing this happen. The labor movement, it's finding its strength. Some analysts have simply said this is a reckoning that's been coming for a while. Others rightly, I think, point to, and I agree with that, others rightly point to the fact that the pandemic has been devastating to individual and local economics, to the extent that people are just sort of fed up with the exploitative economy and ready to fight back. And so we're seeing workers nationwide mobilize and flex their collective muscles in a way that we haven't seen in a few generations. And that's exciting from my perspective. So more power to the labor movement, but to do that and have it be sustainable, some of those protections need to also be turned into policy. We need to see more rights for labor unions and more requirements for employers to deal fairly and equitably with their workers, and to do so with workers who are not unionized. It takes a ton of energy and political will to organize a labor union and to make it powerful. And nearly 90% of US workers don't have that protection right now. A third angle to explore to sort of address the cost of living is not just to raise the minimum wage, but to think about how to raise the global living wage, how to make sure that it is not so profitable for multinational corporations that do business in the United States to have goods manufactured, products manufactured at what in the United States would be severely sub-minimum wages, often sweatshop conditions, and then be able to import those goods into the United States with few barriers or costs and at a significant profit. So how to make it less profitable for countries in our global economy, for companies in our global economy to just move jobs to where the minimum wage is the lowest, or where there is no minimum wage. And so that's a sort of much deeper set of challenges, but we can think about what would be a way to sort of reverse the kind of harm that was done by the North American Free Trade Agreement to make exploiting workers around the world expensive, right? To take away that profit margin so that employers would then need to sort of deal fairly with the workers in any given country in which they're operating. We can also talk about some of the contemporary economic debates we're seeing right now, the need for an expanded social safety net, which is the goal of the Build Back Better program we've been hearing a lot about in the news, which is currently has passed the House of Representatives and will be coming up for a vote relatively soon in the Senate. We can also talk about corporate taxation, and you can listen to our recent episode on taxation for a little bit of information. And of course, there's a lot more out there to learn just about how to invigorate the economy without basically overworking people and not giving them as much back in benefits from our tax dollars. So how do we deal with our rising national debt without just working people to death, essentially? And that's not just a phrase, right? We've heard about the relationship between life expectancy and poverty and overwork. So the reality is that the minimum wage is is part of a set of dynamics which include, parity and fairness in taxation, include the creation of a social safety net for workers, addressing the national debt in a way that is not dangerous for working people, and promoting a living wage at a global scale. And on that note, my book recommendation for today just came out this month, which means I have not even read it, but I'm still going to recommend it based on my respect for the author and those who have already given it rave reviews. And the book is One Fair Wage, Ending Subminimum Pay in America. The author is Saru Jayaraman. Again, that's One Fair Wage, Ending Subminimum Pay in America by Saru Jayaraman. And I want to invite everybody to join us next week for episode 39 on November 28th. That's Sunday at 2 p.m. Pacific time, 5 p.m. Eastern time, on the theme of certified organic standards. So if you're wanting to learn more about how the U.S. Department of Agriculture actually decides when food is organic, and what food is organic and how they enforce those standards, this is the episode for you. Hope to see many of you next week. Thank you all.